So, welcome everybody. Can you hear me okay with this thing? I sound great to me, but it's just everybody else. Yeah. Okay, good. So welcome to the panel discussion on contemplative realism. If you wandered in here not sure what contemplative realism is and are have no idea what's going on, don't worry. By the time we're done, you'll have a good, solid understanding, right? You've promised. And I wanted to make introductions first, and then say a few words, and then each of our participants will offer some short commentary, and then we're hoping to have a discussion that will be both amongst ourselves and amongst the audience. So to begin with, I'm James Matthew Wilson. I actually have to read my own biography because I'm forgetting who I am. The Cullen Foundation Chair in English Literature and the founding director of the MFA program in creative writing at the University of St. Thomas. I'm going to put this into first person. The author of 11 books. My most recent book of poems is The Strangest of the Good, which won the Book of the Year award in poetry from the Catholic Media Awards. The Dallas Institute of Humanities awarded me the Hyatt Prize in 2017, and in addition to my duties at St. Thomas, I serve as poet in residence of the Benedict XVI Institute, as editor of Colosseum Books from the Franciscan University of Steubenville Press, and as poetry editor of Modern Age magazine. 2 seats over to my right is Joshua Hren, who's founder of Wise Blood Books, which has a lovely display at this conference in the book room. If you haven't visited it, please do. And he is co-founder with me of the MFA program at the University of St. Thomas. He regularly publishes essays and poems in such journals as the Los Angeles Review of Books and First Things, America and National Review, Commonweal and Public Discourse, the European Conservative, The Lamp, and New Polity. Joshua's books include the critically acclaimed novel Infinite Regress, and the short story collections This Our Exile and In the Wine Press, the book of poems Last Things, First Things, and Other Lost Causes, Middle-earth and the Return of the Common Good, J.R.R. Tolkien and Political Philosophy, and then yet 2 more books, one which was the subject of a panel discussion in this room a year ago, How to Read and Write Like a Catholic, and then the subject of today's discussion, which I will hold up, Contemplative Realism, a theological aesthetical manifesto. Wish I could take that one back.
It rhymes better.
To my far right is Katy Carl, who is the editor-in-chief of Dappled Things magazine, a project of the Ars Vivendi initiative of the Collegium Institute through the University of Pennsylvania, and a senior affiliate fellow of Penn's program for research on religion and urban civil society. She is the author of As Earth Without Water, a novel published by Wise Blood Books, of Praying the Great O Antiphons, My Soul Magnifies the Lord, from the Catholic Truth Society, and a short story collection that will be forthcoming next year from Wise Blood Books. And I'm proud to say that she is one of our students pursuing her MFA in fiction at the University of St. Thomas in Houston. And finally, I'm pleased to introduce my fellow Michigander, even if a newborn one, Brigid Pasulka, right?
Yep.
Oh,
perfect.
Okay. Whose debut novel a long time ago, and Essentially True, won the 2010 Penn Hemingway Award, the Barnes and Noble Discover Award, and the Polish American Historical Society Creative Arts Award. It was translated into 6 languages, including Polish. Her second novel, which I will also hold up, The Sun and Other Stars, was a Chicago Tribune Editor's Choice and an Indie Next pick. Pasulka's short stories have been published in various literary journals, and she lives with her husband and young son in northern Michigan. So, contemplative realism. As Admiral Stockdale said at a vice presidential debate many years ago, who am I and what am I doing here? What is contemplative realism? We come to announce a revolution is what we come to do, and in a good old-fashioned sense of that thing. About a year ago, sometime last summer, I was having a public conversation with Dana Gioia about the art of poetry and the revival of Catholic letters. And Dana, who had just published in First Things his much widely read and very compelling essay, Christianity and Poetry, argued that the Catholic Church's formidable intellectual traditions were of great importance, but they reach practically nobody. Only 1 or 2 or 3% of all Catholics are going to be deeply stirred in their devotion by that intellectual tradition. What forms the Catholic life, the Catholic sensibility he proposed was the actual life of prayer and of liturgy, and then more broadly of culture. Now, he said this, I suppose, so that our conversation would be interesting, because I, of course, immediately strongly dissented. I proposed rather that, that the great achievements of medieval scholasticism, though they did not exist with the telos of making Dante possible, had, as one of their great fruits, made Dante possible. And if we look back at the early 20th century, what we see is what some people regard as a great shrinking of the church's intellectual life, but in my view is actually one of the great achievements of the church, the rise of Neoscholasticism. We see that the church's outlining of a philosophy such that the young T.S. Eliot could write that the Catholic Church is the only religion that can even pretend to have a philosophy. And I don't read the pretend word too cynically. He was full of admiration for what he was reading. But that the rise of Neoscholasticism actually made possible not just all those wonderful paperbacks like the Ralph McInerney An Introduction to Thomas Aquinas, a book for peeping Thomists and things like that, wonderful the book is, and the Pocket Aquinas, and oh my goodness, there's so many of them. I've got them all on the shelf. But not only did the Thomist revival make possible the widespread dissemination of Aquinas' thought far beyond Louvain or the Catholic seminary, it made possible the ferment for a genuine flourishing of the arts. I have only to mention that famous anecdote of Flannery O'Connor lying in bed, reading the Summa, and her mother telling her to turn off the light, and she says, "Mother, the light shall never be extinguished," and so on and so forth. Said contra. Even for writers who, though deeply religious but didn't have a great theological bone, like J.F. Powers, there was a real richness and plenitude that the church's intellectual renewal made possible, such that we can genuinely say that the church's intellectual renewal does prepare a broader, more widespread renewal of Christian civilization and of the culture. And in fact, I would go so far as to say that not only was it the Neoscholasticism, but even the Nouvelle Théologie in the mid-century period also played a great role in preparing a renewal of arts and letters. And yet again, I'll cite O'Connor, that everything that rises much converge. The title of her last story collection, of course, comes from Teilhard de Chardin. That's a superficial connection, more superficial than Aquinas, but I think it's a meaningful one. If these two precedents are at all to be taken seriously, then I think we can say that in our age, and what's happening in the Catholic arts is in many ways a fruit of the great renewal of Catholic thought that has taken place in the last 30 or 40 years, including here at the University of Notre Dame. As the director of the MFA program at St. Thomas, I'm very pleased to say that we're the only MFA program where I can guarantee that all of our students, or nearly all of them, Tamara, have read Alistair McIntyre's After Virtue, and refer to it casually as they're thinking about the structures of stories. So the great revival of patristics and of scholasticism that I've seen in the last 30 or 40 years, I believe will bear fruit in new works of art coming into being in the years ahead. And I'm thrilled at the prospect of being there to see it. Contemplative realism, however, this in one respect sounds like a throwback. In the 1920s, avant-garde Paris was full of manifestos being proclaimed and printed and sold. The Surrealist Manifesto by André Breton is just the most famous one, but of course before that there was the Futurist Manifesto, and so on and so forth. And so one of the strange flukes of history is that the first book of serious scholastic philosophy to take beauty seriously was also greeted by the wider world of Europe and then the United States as yet another manifesto, and that is Jacques Maritain Art and Scholasticism. It is simultaneously the foundational text of modern theological aesthetics and is also a manifesto among many manifestos. Steve Schlosser, the historian, speaks of how to surrealism and all of these other different kinds of hyphenated realisms, Maritain offered a sacramental realism. And so in Joshua writing this magnificent theological aesthetico manifesto, it may sound in a sense like a throwback. And I think that there's to this 1920s Paris, and I think there's a reason that it should sound like that, and rightly so. Sometime after the 1920s, artists ceased writing manifestos about how the world should be represented. They stopped contesting for what was real, and all of their manifestos faded away and were replaced by DEI statements about representation that had nothing to do with the work of art, but the artist's ethnicity. And so from that long, undogmatic slumber, I think that this manifesto is a bit of an awakening. I just want to say a few words about what kind of awakening it is. Early, in one of the first pages, Joshua quotes Cardinal Ratzinger's Spirit of the Liturgy. Are we not interested in the cosmos anymore, says Ratzinger at the beginning of the Spirit of the Liturgy. And in the argument that unfolds in that book, as many of you will know, Ratzinger says the following: Christ is, of course, first the Savior, and the liturgy is, above all, our saving food in the Eucharist. But the liturgy is also an inbreaking of the cosmos, the whole shape of reality, into the concentration of our prayer. And the central argument of the Spirit of the Liturgy then becomes not only to maintain our vision of Christ the Savior and Christ on the cross at the heart of the liturgy and the heart of Christian worship and the Christian vision of things, but also to recognize that Christ is the Pantocrator, that he is the creator of all things, the creator of the cosmos. Are we not interested in the cosmos anymore? That question for Ratzinger began or continued a renewal that began, of course, with Henri de Lubac and others, a renewal of the church attending not just to Christ the Savior, but to its larger vision about what the world looks like, what it's for, and how it is ordered. And that's borne fruit in many things, including the many papers at this conference, where we're able to think both theologically and scientifically and philosophically about the nature of the real as such. And of course, one of its great fruits was John Paul II's Fides et Ratio, the recovery of the church as, it's as if John Paul II at the end of the century were recapitulating what Eliot said at the beginning of the 20th century, that the Catholic Church must be both the ark of our salvation, but also the place where the world does its thinking. And it must make claims about the nature of reason and about the nature of being. That's what Joshua does in this manifesto. He argues not only in the more familiar ground that the Christian artist must both have a vision of reality that is sufficiently Catholic, sufficiently comprehensive, that it not only portrays salvation and devotion, but also the cross, the ugliness and sin of reality. But he goes further, that the contemplative realist, this artist, this writer, will be one who's attentive not only to the individuated drama of the soul in different existential universe seeking its salvation, but rather will be a writer who is attentive both to the drama of that soul, but also the greater cosmic context in which that soul dwells. And I think this marks a clear improvement, as much as I love O'Connor and J.F. Powers and others, an improvement on what the Catholic revival proposed, because they were really good at capturing the absurdity of the universe and the rationality of Christian belief. But we all know that Kierkegaardian vision of things is not the fullness of what the church has to offer. And so by proposing a contemplative realism, a realism for both the author and the receiver of literature, both the reader and the admirer of works of art, Joshua's giving us the possibility of a full recovery of the cosmos, a full perception of reality that will go down into the depths, but also following St. Bonaventure's itinerarium, will go all the way up and ascend to the vision of God. And so with that introduction, I offer Joshua Wren's comments.
Thank you, James. I just want to make sure that I understood you correctly and that you said that I surpassed Flannery O'Connor. Is that correct? In which case, can you please prostrate yourself and do not just 3 hours, but 3 days of penance for that comment. But now that we've gotten that out of the way, I'd like to begin just with a very short prayer of the Suscipe, which I can't teach without doing. So in the name of the Father, and the Son, and the Holy Ghost. Amen. Take, O Lord, and receive all of my liberty, my memory, my understanding, and my very will. You have given me all that I am, and you have given me all that I possess. And I surrender all of these things back to you, that you may dispose of them according to your will. Please give me only your love and your grace, and with these I will be rich enough and have no more desire. I pray all this with great praise and thanksgiving in Jesus' most holy name. Amen. In the name of the Father, Son, and Holy Spirit. Come. I'm going to begin with some brief remarks about some of the major features or tenets of contemplative realism, with the caveat that there is no technique or sort of how-to or even definition that encapsulates what a contemplative realist would be striving after. Katy and I, who actually kind of developed a lot of the ideas in here together in conversation, in very vigorous kind of back and forth debates and exchanges through emails, letters, phone calls, and in the classroom, were able to work out definitions of contemplative realism, and they just were not, they were solid in a logical sense, but not sufficient. And so I'll just lead with some of the main features, but first I do just want to pay a debt of gratitude to Katy and to a lot of my students in the Master of Fine Arts program at the University of St. Thomas, because it was in the Art of Metaphysics of Fiction class in the inaugural year that we were studying a lot of the real great gains that literary realism brought to the world, and trying to adopt and absorb as much as we possibly could from those natural goods in our own writing, and to articulate and extract in realist works what they do especially well, and kept bumping up against some of the insufficiencies or the limitations of those same realist works. And it was in the classroom that the major ideas of the manifesto kind of emerged, and then it was on a Saturday when I hadn't written for 2 months or something, which is never a good thing for a writer, because that way lies madness. I had told my wife that I just have to, sit down for 20 minutes and hash out an outline, and I think it was 7 hours later, I had completed in this kind of fugue state the draft of the Contemplative Realism Manifesto. And so, again, just that debt of gratitude. So regular realists, literary realists, we could say the same in many ways if we think about visual arts and painting as well, excelled especially at tracing the psychological contours of characters with a tremendous exactitude that had not existed before they came on the scene. So you think about George Eliot, Henry James, and many others who preceded them. There was a strong desire to move beyond the novel's youthful infancy, where fiction had really reduced people to character types and tropes, stereotypes and stock characters, by which, as MacIntyre would say, we kind of make sense of our culture and our civilization, and there's something good about that. Early nascent fiction in the modern period also tended to give us kind of rosy romances rather than hard-boiled, difficult underbellies. And so there was a maturation, you could say. I think that Virginia Woolf said that Middlemarch was the first book ever written for adults or something like that, right? And there's a way that you could take that wrongly, and in a Chestertonian sense, there's a loss of the childlikeness with that movement, but you could also see that there are some real distinctive gains with that shift towards, being willing to have tragic finales and ambivalence and mystery at the end of a narrative rather than 6 plot threads neatly tied together. And so again, the gains are clear, and I don't want to diminish realism's protest against lies, as Willa Cather put it, right? But on the other hand, realist writers, and I'm not just talking about Soviet realism here, which is what we're sort of more in the popular culture kind of more familiar with, but the great realist writers are disinclined to portray or to hint at or to suggest unseen realities. And if it's true, as the Church Fathers bequeath to us, that reality is mostly comprised of unseen realities, and that the sensed and the seen and the smelled is just a tiny little iota. I know we live most of our lives acting as if that's not the case. We live most of our lives keeping heaven and hell and angels and demons in these neatly contained cellars of our souls, so that we can sort of have an immersive material existence. But if it is the case that the unseen is the largest and the most real part of reality, then there's a huge deficit, right, that we find in a lot of those fictional works. And it is the case that a writer like Henry James can tell ghost stories, and he's a founding father of realism. But those ghost stories, as Virginia Woolf says, are kind of only acceptable in the modern period because by the end of the day, yes, they give us this fright and this scare. So she says we have to keep our nightlights on. But they do so because they suggest that those apparently paranormal, supernatural hauntings in the narratives are actually just projections of our unconscious or of the broken human heart and soul. They're not actual angels, ghosts, demons, spiritual entities outside of us, right? And so again, realism is largely deficient, and the contemplative realist wants to develop, expand the gains that I aforementioned, and to portray and to hint at and to use the vestiges of creation to suggest the ladder that moves up towards God in a manner that holds out those realities as objectively existent and not just a kind of maybe, right, part of our world. Also, regular realists have an inclination to portray reality as fundamentally ugly or dark or premised on kind of nothingness even, so that this world is really just a mirage, and underneath it is actually a gaping abyss, as Flaubert actually believed, in spite of the beauties that he was able to render in Madame Bovary, and his own personal belief was that he says, I'm a mystic at bottom and I believe in nothingness, right? And so yet another founding father of realism who proclaimed again that his goal was self-abnegation. I'm going to show you the world as it is. I'm going to, as Newman says, this is one of its virtues, right? We need to represent things not as we want them to be, but as they are. And Flaubert claimed to do that. But if you're attentive to Madame Bovary, you notice that he's not just telling us things as they are, but in sometimes very subtle ways, embedding these patterns into the observations that face his own personal opinions. And those patterns reveal his cynicism So for example, when Emma Bovary, if you've not read Madame Bovary, again, you're forgiven. There's probably dispensation for the rest of the day, but get on it by midnight. And Emma Bovary's, going through, living very lyrically, living a lyrical existence, going through all of her extramarital affairs. And lo and behold, when she's making her way to and from the city and the country, between these affairs, her carriage is regularly crossing a beggar. And Flaubert, again, with great realism, gives us this depiction of that beggar. His shoulders were covered by a mass of rags, and a battered old beaver hat rounded into the shape of a basin. It hid his face, but when he took it off, he revealed two bloody, gaping sockets in place of eyelids. The flesh was falling away in crimson shreds, and from it oozed liquids which hardened into green scabs down to the nose, whose black nostrils were always sniffing convulsively. Okay. And so as Emma Bovary is returning from her extramarital affairs, she's always reminded of this grotesque figure of human suffering and of just the hideousness of existence, right? And it punctures her lyricality. But then she recovers it, right? And so it's no accident that at the very end of the novel, when she's in her deathbed, she has what appears to be a partial conversion, and the priest hands her a crucifix, and she kisses the crucifix with, and I'm quoting from the novel here, the most ardent kiss of love she had ever given. She kissed Christ more ardently than she'd kissed her husband or any of her lovers. But then at that very moment, it just so happens that suddenly, that beggar who is normally always kind of hanging out on that roadside is passing by her window and is singing a song about unrequited love. And that is the last image that she sees in her mind when she dies, is this figure of a man with pus oozing out of his eyes, right? And the idea is that this is the consummation of her disillusionment. Now she sees things as they really are, and this is things as they really are. It's the gutter, right? And so, in a way, realists have an inclination in that direction. I could point to many other examples. It's not a universal phenomenon, but it's an inclination. And that way they fulfill kind of what Pierre Manent talks about when he describes what Machiavelli was up to in his creation of realism, where he says Machiavelli concentrates our attention on all of the pathologies of political life. He doesn't talk about, reigns that last long or periods without revolution. He talks about corruption, coups, and fixates our attention on those things for such a long period of pages that we begin to have the illusion that that's all there is to political life. Right? And so the literary realist tends to, again, do the same. The contemplative realist, responding to that, I would say, acknowledges what we would call, with a Catholic vision, not the gritty underbelly, but the cruciform, let's name it for what it really is, the cruciform aspects of existence, but does not suggest or conclude that that is the totality of existence, right? So, for example, there's a poem by the Oklahoma poet laureate Benjamin Myers, and it's called The Reverend on Natural Theology, and it reads as such. Seeing God in nature, do you see him crucified? The rabbit ripped by dogs, its guts strewn across a crew-cut field, the hide left wet where it was stripped. Driving through countryside, you sometimes see a line of coyote pelts hung from barbed fence, flapped by high wind, bothered with flies and flea, infested, bullet holes in all the skins. Do you then read the book of nature's red ink, dribbled down the posts? Consider all the world's wide gore, the white-tailed deer that spread across the road, the earth's unlapped offal. Everything broken must be broken again. I will make you fishers of men. Okay? So, again, that's an acknowledgement of that cruciform side of existence without sort of insisting upon it pathologically or in a heavy-handed way. And I'll give a couple of other examples and then turn things over to Katy. But in Chezwa Miłosz's letter to Thomas Merton, he picks up on the opposite error in Merton's poetry and in some of his letters that he's writing to Miłosz at this time. And he says, every time you speak of nature, it appears to you as this soothing, rich in symbols, almost like a veil or a curtain. Right? You do not pay enough attention to torture or suffering in nature. Right? In other words, study predators, right? And so again, there's two disparate errors and that need to be corrected. And the contemplative realist seeks to do that. And I'll give an example from Willa Cather's Death Comes for the Archbishop, which is in many ways an embodiment of the aesthetic that I'm describing, and not entirely because I think that Cather, for all of the beauties of that novel, she admits that she's trying to beautify life, not show it as it really is. And you can tell that because when you read about the genocides, they don't really feel like genocides. It's sort of this little thing that happens in the background. And again, I don't mean to disparage her, but it's in a sense, it's a missing part of reality, right, in that novel. And so, but in the beginning of the novel, Father Latour is a missionary priest from France, missing his lovely French salads, on his donkey, riding through the New Mexican desert, and he's lost. And he's going in circles, and all that he can see is what Cather describes as geometrical nightmares. Okay, so the world has become, the created world that God has given us has become for him a geometrical nightmare because everything looks the same. There's no way to distinguish whether he's right or wrong in his path. But it's precisely at that moment that his animal, not himself, leads him to a tree. And that tree is in the shape of a cross. You see? So, again, Cather holds both parts of nature, both its cruciform state, its brokenness, and also its salvific capacity to signify and to lead us up the St. Bonaventure's ladder. And I'll end on that note, that in one of its greatest one of contemplative realism's greatest aspirations is to take narratives, to take modern fiction, and to move it beyond anthropomorphism. Okay, instead of giving us a universe where man is in the center, you know, we study this. The novel and fiction in general is the study of the self, you could say, right? It's the exploration more than any other art form of what it means to be a self, right? And that's, again, brought tremendously great insights and self-knowledge, but it also can create a kind of claustrophobic universe where man is way too big for his britches. He forgets to suffer and to sing with the rest of the cosmos, as Benedict said. And so, for example, at the end of Dostoevsky's The Idiot, when Nastasia Filipovna, one of the main heroines, has been murdered by Rogozin, and Prince Mishkin, the good, sort of naive prince, too innocent, is with Rogozin, the bitter, angry murderer. And they're both standing over the dead body of Nastasia Filipovna. Suddenly, a fly buzzes into the room at that very placid and dignified instant. And there's sort of two ways to read that, right? On the one hand, it could be felt as an insult to human life. And you get more of that, though, in, for example, Stephen Crane's Red Badge of Courage, where he depicts these dead soldiers whose skin has turned yellow, and he depicts these ants kind of trundling little bundles across the lips of the dead man. And there's a sense in which there's almost like a gloating in the way that these less than human creatures have kind of triumphed over us, right? Whereas in Dostoevsky, it's more of a kind of a reminder that there is this larger cosmic vision that has patterns that, as St. Augustine says in City of God, when we look at predators and when we look at insects intervening on our lives, we can't help but want to swat them away because they seem like disruptions to our human-centeredness. But if we had God's vision, we would see that they participate in patterns and in an order that surpasses us. So again, what we're calling for is an aesthetic that consciously seeks to expand in that way. And I'll turn it over to Katy.
Thank you. Just to begin, I want to echo the same gratitude for Dr. Hren for articulating what, when I initially read the Contemplative Realist Manifesto, I realized was something I had been trying to do in my own fiction for more than a decade, and something that I had been trying to discover and cultivate and lift up through my work at Dappled magazine, where I am the editor-in-chief. That said, I speak primarily as a fiction writer, primarily as a practitioner of this style, this literary aesthetic style that seeks to both presence, reality as we experience it, both on the horizontal dimensions and the vertical dimensions. And I think it responds to a question that certainly as a writer I've experienced, and I think is not uncommon for students of literature to wonder about, and I think is the source of some of the tensions that we tend to hear about between faith and fiction, as between faith and any discipline, right? You begin to wonder if, things are really as the materialist realist wants to presence them, and if the things that, the faith has formulated for us are true, why don't we more readily see the appearance of that truth in, in the horizontal details of our lives? And I think it's frequently, or in the horizontal details of a novel such as Flaubert's depiction of Madame Bovary. I think it's frequently because we're not sufficiently attentive to the possible valences of those details. And one tenet of contemplative realism is the need to be attentive to creation itself, and to our experience both of the external world and of our interior world as polysemous, right, as multivalent, as bearing multiple meanings simultaneously without invalidating any of the superficial or apparent meanings. There are depths to us. And so I think that makes, it's one of the things that makes contemplative realism, this artistic practice, but with spiritual and philosophical implications. Very much like Saint Teresa, the patron saint of contemplative realism, I have to say that anything I say about philosophy or theology is subject to the correction of people who are much more learned in those disciplines than I am. But I think about character creation in fiction, in a Thomistic and a personalist sense. We think about the human person, right, as having a nature that involves powers of the soul. We're body and soul. And our soul has powers of intellect, of will, passions, inclinations, right, and all of these come together in a uniqueness that is the individual human person. There are commonalities between us, but also unrepeatable differences. And it's those unrepeatable differences that a fiction writer is frequently attempting to capture, right, on the page, and get across and explore the mystery of free will, of why we choose as we choose, and of what effects that has for the the larger implications and connections of our lives, I think that to contrast that with a depiction of such as George Saunders gives of the soul in Lincoln and the Bardo, where he has souls that are more advanced, coming down to the Bardo to tell the souls who still think that they are themselves, you aren't what you think you are. You aren't this particularity. You aren't this kind of nature, and I think the quote is, I'm doing this from memory, but we tell you this to speed you on your way. That the soul's journey in that under that kind of understanding could only continue once you let go of the particularities. On the contrary, I come from an understanding of the human person that's deeply shaped by this Thomistic and personalist tradition. I'm relying here on Norris Clarke's little book *Person and Being*, where he talks about the human person as something that has what he calls own being, has a core, right? That is real, is its own active existence given to it by God. But at the same time, it's self-aware and it's free, but it's not existing in a vacuum. It's not radically autonomous. It exists in relation. It exists precisely in relation to itself, to others, and to God. So how do you get across that depth in a novel without flattening everything out? As someone put it at lunch, Katy Broussard right there. I see. How do you illustrate the invisible? Right? I think you can see it by its effects, right? And I think that this is what a contemplative realist depiction of the soul in literature is attempting to do. So, I guess to jump from there to a discussion of what you have to, how you have to sort of dispose yourself toward the world in order to practice this, right? Clarke also talks about the receptivity of the human person, and in theories of art like Jacques Maritain Art and Scholasticism, to name another manifesto, he talks about the need for the artist to be attentive, the need for the artist to be disposed toward creation, right? And Clarke talks about this receptivity as active receptivity and as a kind of perfection that the human person can have, right? But it's a perfection that implies a poverty. It's a perfection that implies you are not, the source of what you're discussing is the source of what you're generating in the creative act is not you, it's not yourself, and it's not solely the tradition either. Although I take as true almost everything that Eliot says in Tradition and the Individual Talent when he talks about the need to assimilate and integrate the tradition, that you can't create anything new without doing that. At the same time, that isn't, that those are acts that are happening within the artist's individual nature, but they're not, and they involve multiple decisions and acts on the part of the artist, but they're ultimately not sourced in the artist's being. They're sourced in the ground of being to which the artist is in relation, and that's not primarily horizontal at all. It's also a vertical relation to God, as well as to the creation. So. To give some kind of examples of possible, ways of doing this or putting this into practice, I want to contrast the way that Zola begins his novel, *The Masterpiece*, which is about artists trying to create a new style, and they bring this new style into being, and no one understands what they're doing. And they along the way, one of the protagonists has a relationship with a woman who's his model. And they begin in this sort of state of mutual suspicion, mistrust. It's sort of an anti-Eden. There's a general resistance to trusting each other, and the relationship does eventually devolve. Not to spoil the ending, but I'm going to spoil the ending. the relationship is sacrificed in the end to his art. It's almost as if under that understanding of what it is to be a creator, you can't be both human and be a creator. There's a sort of appropriation of divine privilege. And I think a contemplative realist ethos, in contrast, stands against that appropriation of divine privilege for the artist. You're more an instrument of the divine than trying to mimic, right? Although, as Jean Paul II says in his letter to artists, artists more than anyone, he says, understand what it might have been for God to sit and create the universe, and why God might have done that, not out of necessity, but out of sheer love for the goodness of being and the desire for being to make more of itself, for there to be more of being, as Gilles might have it. So to conclude, I want to present the contrast that I told you I would, which and do so by pulling in what I might consider one of many possible precursors to contemplative realist practice, which is Liane Vla and The Woman Who Is Poor. This is another novel where another artist's model, who's she is the protagonist, Clotilde, The Woman Who Is Poor. The novel is centered on her perspective rather than on the artists who use her as a model, right? It's centered on her dependence, her vulnerability, her need for for reality, basically, and for relation to others, and the ways that breaks down our presence by the brokenness of creation and of human relation to each other and the divine is profoundly presenced in that novel. But the way that he begins is with that novel opens with a mention of God and a sort of invocation of God, even through the mouth of a character who's blaspheming. So you get this sort of meticulous horizontal detail, the same kind of meticulous horizontal detail that you get from a naturalist like Zola or from a materialist realist like Flaubert. But you also get a meticulous attention to the horizontal dimension of human experience and the current back toward God. So with that, I think I'll wrap and turn it over to Brigid to talk a bit more about the practice of contemplative realism, or the way that that's attractive in particular to the writer.
So I'm glad that it's being called a practice. I'm here as the representative of the authors. What's the quote? Of deep faith, but not an intellectual bone. So I came to this panel and to read this manifesto because I like to listen to podcasts while I run. And a couple months ago, he kept popping up, first on Catholic Culture podcast, and then on the Marcy Stokeman's Well-Read Mom podcast, and it was like a lightning bolt for me, because I felt, as Katy did, that this is a fundamental text. I think every Catholic writer needs to read this. I think and fellow travelers, as you put it, which I like. But I also had the feeling, this is what I've been trying to do for the past 20 years. And I definitely see it as a practice. Now, what resonated with me as a writer so much, I'm going to hit the highlights. I'm probably paraphrasing you in a very basic way, so you can argue with me later.
It'll actually make sense.
But there's a huge emphasis on seeing clearly. Many examples about seeing clearly and really getting into what does that mean? Whose reality? Second, the things that can cloud that vision for a writer. And you mentioned a few and elaborate on a few. One of them is technology. I would also add to that, that we all live curated lives. Nobody's listening to random things. Nobody's reading random things or watching random things anymore. So I would say that curation is also, I'd like to add to the list that Josh was already talked about in contemplative realism. The third thing is that really resonated with me was the need to conscientiously clean that lens for yourself, and constantly through various ways. And lastly, that the ultimate goal of, the writer to the reader is similar to God's relationship with us, which is, yes, I will meet you wherever you are, even if that is in the muck, but I'm not going to let you stay there, right? So as a writer, you are going to meet that person with full realism wherever their situation is in life. You're going to meet that character there, but you're not going to let that character stay there. That is not our faith. So I'm not actually going to talk too much about my writing, except to say that you can judge it for yourself, whether I'm a Catholic realist, if you get that far on the reading list from this conference. And the one part that I didn't have a name for myself until I read this, but Joshua gave me the realist of distances. I have only ever written novels and short stories set in foreign countries, and not with American protagonists, always with foreign protagonists. So I've written, about Russia and Poland and Ukraine and Italy and East Germany, and it's always been a foreign protagonist as well. When I write in first person, 2 of the 3 books that I've written in first person are, one was a 20-year-old Italian boy when I was 30, or when I was 40, I think I wrote that. And then, and now I'm writing in the persona of a 70-year-old Ukrainian man. So I am, I feel like very strongly that distance in experience gives me proper perspective and more perspective with which to contemplate my characters. I am against the trend that says you can only, you're only allowed to write from your own experience. I find that, a really a sad poverty, because both for the writer and for the reader, because writing and reading things that are not your own experience give you an empathy like nothing else, I would say. So I don't really want to talk more about my writing, because I want to talk about this idea that it's a practice. And I want to talk a little bit about the graces that have been given to me that allow me to hopefully practice contemplative realism. I think that's what I've been doing. So the graces that are given to me, but also the conscious efforts that I make. So I would say the biggest grace that's been given to me in my life as a novelist is, this wide-ranging experience. As a fiction writer, you have to get to know, a Catholic world, small c Catholic world. You have to get to know everybody. I am blessed that I grew up, partly in a farming township of 100 people. I grew up partly a little bit in the suburbs. I spent a lot of time in a city of 3 million. I spent a couple of years in a mega city of 11 million. Now I live in a town of 6,500. I was blessed that at parts of my childhood, we were wealthy enough to have a private tennis court with our house. And then at parts of my childhood, we were so poor that we were evicted a couple of times from apartments. And that is a wide, ranging experience. I am, grateful that I have a large extended family. My dad is one of 13. I have 50 cousins on that side. We cover every aspect of the political spectrum and the social spectrum. I ended up falling in love and marrying a PK, which to translate for Catholics is a preacher's kid, so Protestant. And, becoming a mother, of course, that opens up a completely new realm of experience. We are all on this panel parents of young children, and that's a whole different realm of experience. I have also been blessed, with the grace to have many, many different work experiences. I worked in residential treatment on the south side of Chicago with mostly gang-involved girls. I have had a lot of conversations with girls who just experienced terrible abuse, found in cages naked in their own feces abuse. And there was a period of time when I was teaching, English to oligarchs in Moscow, which, somebody picks you up in a bulletproof car and with their bodyguard and takes you to an undisclosed location, and then they tell you in conversation about all their ridiculously wild lifestyle, and then the last 20 years I spent at a high school in Chicago in a writing center. So I'm talking one-on-one with high school students all day, mostly about their college personal essays, which, there are tears, you dig deep into people's lives. And this was a very diverse school with diverse backgrounds. I consider these, both my personal experience and my work experience and all the stories that I've heard, that is my greatest grace as a novelist. My conscious efforts, one of my conscious efforts is to see everything, every experience as a gift. I, had the privilege to go through clinical depression, 7 or 8 years ago. Thankfully it came and went, but I did not know what people had experienced until I experienced it. I am so grateful that I had that gift. Just little things of life. I'm surprised how many people don't clean their own toilets anymore or mow their own lawn. That kind of menial task and manual labor, I feel really brings you to a different perspective and a different understanding of the world. So trying to see everything as a gift. The second thing that I do that my brother taught me is listen. It doesn't do any good, if all these people come through your lives, if you're not curious, if you're not listening to them. I remember being a teenager and, my siblings and I think it was just my younger brother and I were stuck at like the back table of a wedding. So we barely made the guest list. We were sitting with the photographer at a half empty table, and my brother turns to the guy next to him. He's this old guy. I'm not very interested. My brother can draw anything out of anybody. This guy turned out to be a concentration camp survivor, and the rare one who is willing to talk about his experience. And that was the lesson that I needed. You have all these people in your lives, and it's really crucial as a novelist, as a contemplative realist, to listen, which is also in the book. And St. Benedict. So Joshua and St. Benedict also recommend that. So, and prayer. I'm glad that we started with a prayer. I feel like you need overt prayer in your life. I have 3 pictures of JP2 in my office that I stare at. One is him looking, with that Slavic jaw, looking very serious. And one is him deep in prayer, and one is him making googly eyes like this. So I look at, all 3 of those. When I need to get serious, I look at this, that kind of Slavic one. And then, when I need more prayer in my life, I look at him deep in prayer. And then when I need the googly eyes, sometimes you need, to not take yourself so seriously. But, involving the saints in your writing life like that, in your environment. I have taken manuscripts to an empty church and said, God, what the heck am I supposed to do with this mess? And you have to ask, that's your, you ask about so many other things, you have to ask. I also do an audit with myself periodically. So input, output, and thought. So not even talking about the quality of things, but what's the quantity of the input, like what you consume, reading, listening, viewing, versus, the quantity of output, writing for me, versus the time thinking. I have been off balance at different times in my life, and you need to get back on balance if you're going to be a contemplative realist. You need all three. But I would say the greatest thing that has helped me, the practice that I kind of stumbled into because I was in a very busy part of my life, was, integrating contemplation and prayer with reality. And it seems very simple, but I wasn't doing it, which, this piggybacks on something that Joshua was saying in his manifesto, which is you have to love your characters. You have to love not only your characters, but, sorry to paraphrase you if I'm doing it wrongly, but you have to love humanity. You have to love people, and you have to love, you have to love humanity and join that with your love for God, and see the world and, as unified under God. So, what does this look like in my life? I mean, as a parent, there's a lot of places where reality meets contemplation. And, it also teaches you a lot of virtues you don't want to learn. But, yesterday, my son's 8, and he asked me, does God want me to play Minecraft? And, you can brush that question off, or you can dig into it, I dug into, the inherent good of the world, and, the need for detachment, and, the general guidelines where, if something brings you closer to God, you should do more of it. And if something brings you farther from God, you should do less of it. Simple moments like that. I've also started a long time ago, praying for strangers. So I would see 40 kids in a day coming through my office. And on a good day, I would say a prayer as each one left. I would say a prayer for that kid. I had to proctor the SAT more than once, and you're sitting there for 3 hours, and I would pray the rosary on their heads. And it really changes your perspective. I hope I had no former students here who are creeped out by that. But, it changes your perspective if you're dwelling for the length of of a Hail Mary on somebody's head. I used to do it in traffic. I had a nightmare of, a commute that covered like a quarter of the city of Chicago from the west side to the northwest side, and that took me 45 minutes each way. So, you pray the rosary as you're passing tent cities, and moms with their strollers, and old people who can barely get across the street, and, kids messing around on the corner. And that really, I would play the, Father Barron's rosary in the background and pray along as much as I could, without hitting anything. And that gives you a real scope of humanity. And, it forces you to do exactly what this is asking you to do, and contemplate that.
Yeah, if I could just interject
Please.
just for a second, because I think that, right, I mean, there's a Mauriac passage that I cite where he says that if there's a reason for the novelist on the earth, it is this: to show the element which holds out against God in the highest and noblest characters, and the innermost evils and dissimulations, and also to light up the secret source of sanctity in creatures who seem to us to have failed. And I think it just, what you're describing is a disposition, and that's one of the main arguments of the book, is that a contemplative realist approach is not something that I wish to be relegated to artists, but rather that it is just a human disposition that it's worth cultivating for anyone. It is also, though I think it happens to be the case, that because artists do tend to do that, if you're making a character, you have to spend a lot of time with her, and if she seems really insignificant at first, you have to figure out why she's significant, and that takes a lot of listening and waiting. And so then, by virtue of reading the fruits of a writer who has done that same thing, we receive the ability or the gift, really, of a shortcut, so to speak, of, not having to ogle or to gaze for quite so long, but to benefit from someone else having done so.
So the question I had prepared, is this on? Yeah, the question I had prepared for you all was, is contemplative realism best thought of as a formal or a material principle? Is it how or what? And then also, is it something that's referred to a way of being an author or a work or a way of receiving the work? And Brigid and Joshua answered both those questions. It's a practice, and yes was the answer. So since I got my question answered,
And Grace.
I think it's time for you all to get your questions answered. Yeah, I think we need to have the microphone because it's being recorded. So yes, please.
Hi, thank you guys so much. So my question is, let's see, this may sound a little blunt, but I'm wondering, like, how do you balance, like, why put a name to it, essentially? Why? So my first instinct would be, it might be distracting to have the label of contemplative realism, and that might distract from the art of just telling a good story.
Yeah.
How do you balance that, and why?
Yeah. So that's a great question. I mean, Zadie Smith famously responded to the New Yorker critic James Wood, who called her work hysterical realism, and she, said that basically, so much cannibal tuna gets caught in the net when you start using these labels heavy-handedly. And so I take great pains to do a lot of apologizing in the first few pages, spelling out all the weaknesses against doing that. But on the other hand, man's ability to see is in decline in a very serious way, as Josef Pieper said 60 years ago. If that was true then, my goodness, all of the apparatuses that were supposed to increase our vision have distracted us, etc. Right? Man's ability to see is in severe decline. And so there was a desperate sense of urgency. And as James was saying, it's also, there are times, I think, in the artistic world where it's worth sort of trying to galvanize and gather like-minded fellow travelers and to articulate what we're trying to do and to articulate what's already been done, but that maybe hasn't quite been shed light on in that particular way. It doesn't really matter at the end of the day whether that is going to live down in history as being like this, contemplative realism or whatever. I could care less, right? It is more unnecessary limitation that is a bridge to help us to gain clarity. For example, I don't think, and it happens in different ways too. You talk about, like, is it a how, is it a why? There's a great story by Willa Cather called Two Friends. And it's not always a matter of art habituating us into possessing these contemplative gazes ourselves. Sometimes it's a matter of a story showing us a character who's incapable of doing that, or who has the opportunity to do that and who misses, right? So there's Mr. Dylan, and I forgot the other character's name in Cather, but they're sitting there talking with one another, and there's the transit. I'm gonna find it here. Okay, so they're sitting there talking to one another on the porch, and lo and behold, they happen to be right next to these decrepit buildings that are an eyesore, right? And while they're sitting next to these decrepit buildings that are an eyesore, engaging in a kind of friendly conversation, the transit of Venus is happening in the heavens. And she paints it with just a few quick brush strokes. Then we saw a bright wart on the other edge of the moon, but for a second only. The machinery up there worked fast. While the two men were exclaiming and telling me to look, the planet swung clear of the golden disk. A rift of blue came between them and widened very fast. The planet did not seem to move, but that inky blue space between it and the moon seemed to spread, and the thing was over. Okay, so now, of the two characters, one of them, right, Mr. Dillon, when Mr. Truman tries to get him to shift his gaze up and to marvel at this, right, he says, I will respond to your summons to wonder once we have a federal government that is honest and as good as good banking business, then it will be plenty of time to turn our attention to the stars, right? So like once we've actualized the eschaton, then we can start thinking about wonder. And he walks away having completely missed the gaze that Cathar invites us to, right? So, and there's something about, in other words, like there's something about us witnessing a character who fails to see it that then we say, oh yeah, I do that too, don't you, right? So.
Just a quick word, and then I want to turn things over to Katy. You know, when we were planning the Master of Fine Arts program, one of the cardinal texts we had was an early, or not early, by no means, a early 2000s Commonweal article by Alistair McIntyre on the Catholic University, where he says that Catholic universities should rebuke secular universities not for failing to be Catholic, but for failing to be universities. And that's how we conceived of the Master of Fine Arts program, is that we're the first and the only Master of Fine Arts program rooted in the Catholic tradition. And what that entails for us is not a niche or a special kind of literature, but rather to be the program that's genuinely open to the fullness of things. That von Balthasar says that the Christian must be the guardian of metaphysics in the modern age. We have to remain open to being because God is being itself. Whereas if one loses sight of that faith, that creedal commitment to the openness of being itself, you can easily close yourself off into some small little pet ideology, right. Which I think, so what Josh was announcing is not one more realism among others, but rather the recovery of realism.
Yeah, and that's part of the reason why it's so difficult to define. And just real quick, I know Katy, I want to give it to Katy, but you know, there was a, I mean, there's a sense in which, right, there have been so many kind of strictly defined realisms that say every generation has its own, such as, you know, hysterical realism, Soviet realism, right? You know, and the uptake of that, as James Wood, the New Yorker critic, says, is that then, you know, you experience that over time. Everyone's claiming to that they're going to give you the real deal. And everyone else is saying, no, then the next generation comes on. No, you got that totally wrong. Now we're showing you the real. If you experience life like that for a long enough period, you're going to just begin to doubt that there is such a thing as reality. And then you begin to see these works of art or representation as a whole as just sort of like a language game. Do you know what I mean? It's not actually connected to anything. It's completely a sort of a shifting conventional subjective imposition.
It's precisely because of that degradation of the use of language that I want to make a still stronger case for the necessity of the signifier, because we have so many threads that are converging in contemplative realism, both from literary traditions and from the Catholic intellectual tradition, that there needs to be some way of naming that. Someone said earlier that when we name, we're participating in creation in the mode that's proper to us as human beings. We're naming contemplative realism as such because it draws together, it converges together so many of these threads. And again, that's important because it's an aid to vision, and because you have to be able to see well before you can act well. It's prior to any action. And Brigid, yeah.
And I just see it as a difference between a first draft and subsequent drafts. So the first draft, you're just writing by the seat of your pants, you're writing by your instinct, you know, the light in your headlights. And then at a certain point in a novel, you have to become intentional on a certain draft. And so, you know, this is going to help me be intentional, you know, not to the point where it sacrifices the novel, but, you know, at a certain point, you have to be intentional. You can't just wing it, I think, you know. So even if you just inform yourself, I think that's really helpful.
One last, oh my gosh. All right, just because we have to go opposite sides. Todd?
Hi, Todd Harch, Eastern Kentucky University. It seems like a problem for me with non-contemplative realism is that it's just not very realistic because it doesn't deal with the reality that we live in. And one of those realities is angels and demons and miracles. How does contemplative realism deal with those things, which seem very hard to depict well in fiction?
one of the authors who I cite is J.K. Huysmans, the French decadent writer who converted from Satanism to Catholicism. And I want to talk about life experience. And so he has a novel called The Damned. And it is, he portrays, you could say that he portrays, as Katy was saying, spiritual realities, both the darkness of being possessed or being severely oppressed, and the luminous power of the Eucharist, for example, right? He portrays all of those things through their effects, but the effects are so intensified relative to the rest of the action that it's actually it's really hard to even read the novel, because it obtains such a sense of presence of both evil and good that it's haunting, and it's hard to you're convinced, you're persuaded that these things that are just being alluded to or suggested without being painted, right? Like he's not painting the shape of the demon or something like that. It's just being suggested that that's the only possible cause that could explain the level of darkness that is being rendered, and you walk away saying, yeah, you're right. So I think it has, I mean, without getting too technical, that's how I would describe it. There's things you could talk about on the level of technique, of how you achieve intensification, but I don't want to.
Brigid, last word.
Yeah, I would say very little of what you are actually thinking while you're writing a novel ends up on the page, ideally. So you just take it for granted. That's the simple answer, is you just take for granted that there's a visible world and an invisible world. And I don't know how, but it comes through.
I am so sorry that we've run out of time. I know there are many other hands that were up in the air, and I would love for the conversation to continue. But for the moment, could we just put our hands together and thank our panelists?